Okay, good morning to you, and welcome to today's Thursday lecture. We are going to complete our work on Barclay today and finally reach the conclusion of his argument against the independent nature of material substance, right? Everything that exists is dependent on a perceiver. So Philonous argues against Hylus, the materialist. I assume that all of you by now either were present at Monday morning's plenary, or indeed you've seen the video which was uploaded to the YouTube channel dedicated to these Monday lectures, right? So all of you, I'm assuming you have by now attended or seen, or both, Monday's lecture. And you have any essay homework? Well, it will be assigned. I think the syllabus is really clear on this point, that the first essay is focused on the first 5 readings, and the essay questions you will choose among are the ones focused on 5 readings. So we're only still in the second reading, so we have a little time yet before and I'll give you 2 weeks notice for the due date, okay? So please bear with me. We're going to cover, it will be into the 4th reading, at least, before I give you 2 weeks notice. You're welcome, so don't worry about that. Just stay focused on the material for now. And I had a talk about that. Yeah, somebody else had asked this question. Somebody on Monday had asked whether they're supposed to answer all the 8 or 9 questions or just one of them, and I emphasized very clearly, and I'll repeat it for your benefit, that this isn't a quiz. This will be an essay, so you will pick one question from each group, right? There's a set of questions for the first group of readings and the first essay, and from that list you choose one, whichever one you like, and don't answer all of them, just one of them, and that will be the basis of your essay. But that will be assigned to you. Don't worry, I will be announcing it, I'll be emailing it, I'll be posting it on Blackboard. So hopefully if you're paying any attention on any of those wavelengths, you'll be mindful of the first due date. Okay, fair enough. Am I the only one who can just see a blank screen? Well, Drew, I'm seeing everybody here. I'm seeing the normal Blackboard Collaborate Ultra screen. I see the names of everybody who's here, who's broadcasting. I see the chat room. I see all that stuff. So if you're not seeing the normal screen with me on it and speaking to you, and with the others who are in the room, then your connection is not quite right. You could either log out and reconnect, or you could try dialing in. Anna, you've just asked a question that has just been asked and answered. I haven't, reconnect. I have not assigned the date yet, and I will, okay? So please, first of all, come on time, so that I don't have to repeat answers that I just a minute ago given, or I don't have to sound rude and say, look, I've already answered this question. The class starts at 11. I start at 11. That's a very good time to be in the room for your benefit, so that you don't miss anything. And some of you, I mean, there's no more late subway, like people would come late because the subway was late. Yeah, that happens a lot. But right now, I'm assuming your commute is quite short, but please be on time. And if you do miss part of a class, of course, all of these classes are recorded. Yeah, all the lectures are recorded. The Monday plenaries are up on YouTube, and our Thursday session here, just for this, this class, these Thursday sessions are all recorded, and they're on Blackboard. You know by now how to find them. Some of you have emailed me about this, and I've answered you patiently, I hope, to tell you that if you go to the Blackboard page for this course, you'll see a big black bar across the top that says Sessions, and on the left-hand side of that, there's a menu icon. If you click on the menu icon, you'll see a link to recordings, and then you can watch each and every Thursday lecture at your convenience, okay? So please be mindful of that as well. All right. Are there any questions about Barclay? Anything that was covered on Monday that you wish to question? Or are you happy with what we discussed? Not specifically? Okay, Melody, that's fine. If you have if any specific questions come up, feel free to type them in, okay, or to speak. And if no one has questions, I will just pick it up where we left off, and we'll continue looking at the dialogue together and see now where Barclay is going to go in order for Philonous to take Hylus further down this road of denying the independent existence of material substance, right, which was the name of the game. So let me share the screen with you. And once again, I pulled up my own file, so it's a lot quicker and a lot easier for me to scroll through the file rather than trying to do it from the Google Drive folder. So I have this thing right here, and I'll pull it up right now. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody sees this. This is where we left off on Monday, where we said that Hylus was now convinced, at least for the time being, that there are no so-called secondary properties that exist outside of a perceiving mind. Yes, or you remember all this? I hope Monday wasn't too long ago for you. So just remember that qualities or properties of things were divided into primary and secondary. And the secondary, so-called secondary properties of things, good, you remember, Mami, that's very good. I'm glad you do. Please keep memory going. And that, so these so-called secondary properties of things are colors, odors, sounds, tastes, and textures. Yeah, all of that stuff. And by virtue of this argument that the only way we know these things are through our immediate perceptions, so it's evidence of the senses, and then the immediate perceptions that we pick up from the world are converted in our minds to immediate perceptions. So we're able to identify, oh, that's a banana, or, you know, that's a violin, or that's whatever it is that our senses are telling us, or that's a tree, you know, or the grass is green, or the fire is hot, whatever we think, whatever we perceive. But at the end of the day, these perceptions are just ideas in our minds. The only contact we have with the world, actually, is our conceptualizations of the world. And these conceptualizations of the world are coming to us through our senses, and the immediate perceptions are not understood. The senses are just conveying information. The information is immediately processed in our minds, says Philonous. And so it's really the ideas that we form through perception that constitute our sole evidence of existence. If there's something going on out there that no one can perceive, then of course no one knows that it exists. If there's something going on that only you perceive, then you think it exists because you perceive it. And if nobody else perceives it, then for them it doesn't exist. So existence is perception and nothing else. And he went on, as we went through the text together, we saw that sensations like the heat of the fire, the heat is not in the fire, it's in our ability to sense heat. We saw that, or temperature, we saw the same thing going through with taste, that things aren't really in themselves sweet or sour or salty. It's our taste buds that convey that information, and we form the idea of sweetness. So again, perception is existence. It's not that the sweetness is in the food or the saltiness is in the food. The same food tastes different to different people, which is very strong evidence to support the idea that the taste is not in the food. The taste is in our senses, yeah? Okay? And colors, finally. We talked about the sunset, and we said that, well, the colors are not in the clouds. The colors are in our perceptions of things, okay? That's all on Monday's lecture, and if any of you haven't yet seen it, then, of course, you should tune in on YouTube and have a look. Okay, so Hylus backs off now and says, I have to admit, Philonous, that I can't keep this up any longer. Colors, sounds, taste, and a word, all that are termed secondary qualities, have no existence outside the mind. So that is a big admission from this materialist, right? A huge admission from this materialist, that all these so-called secondary qualities do not exist outside the human mind, or the mind of the perceiver, whichever kind of mind it is. But in granting this, he says, I don't take anything away from the reality of matter or external objects, because various philosophers maintain what I just did about secondary qualities, and yet are far from denying matter. So to be clearer, philosophers, and by this, the note says in the PDF that philosophers means philosophers and scientists. That's an interesting aside. We're talking about the early to mid 18th century. No one in that time was called a scientist. The word was not in use. and may or may not be clear to you. The greatest scientists of that day would not have called themselves scientists. They would have called themselves natural philosophers or experimental philosophers. So theoretical science at that time was called natural philosophy, philosophy of nature, yeah? Trying to understand nature. And that was the job of philosophers. Experimental philosophy was what we call today experimental science. So in any case, the dialogue is referring to this. Philosophers maintain what I just did. That means philosophers and people whom today, like Isaac Newton or whoever, Robert Boyle, these people would have described themselves as philosophers, and they are dividing sensible qualities into primary and secondary. And so Hylus, who's not giving up on materialism, is now drawing this line in the sand, so to speak, and he's saying, okay, I concede the secondary stuff. That's all in the mind. That's all a matter of, it's not matter. It's what the mind is doing. The existence of secondary qualities depends on a perceiving mind. Okay, I grant that. But he says the primary qualities still have independent existence. They're out there, independent of whether they're being perceived or not. And what are those qualities? Those qualities are extendedness, and that was the same as Descartes, right? Descartes is writing a century earlier, but they're using that notion of extension, meaning extension is something that takes up space, right? Something that's extended, however large or however small. If it's extended in one dimension, we call that length. If it's extended in 2 dimensions, we call that area. And if it's extended in 3 dimensions, we call it volume, yeah? So primary quality would be the actual length or area or volume that something takes up. That's the meaning of extendedness. Shape, whether something's round or square or elliptical or spherical, what have you, that's deemed to be a primary property of the object, belongs to the object. Solidity means density, mass per unit volume. Gravity means weight, how much something weighs. Motion is obviously whether it's moving, and that can be measured, right? Rest is when it's not moving, okay? So these things really exist in bodies, so they're meant to be properties of bodies themselves. And sensible secondary qualities are all the sensible things that aren't primary, and philosophers assert that these are merely sensations or ideas existing nowhere but in the mind. So he's conceding that point, but he's not conceding the point on the primary stuff. So Philonous' next job then, now that he's convinced Hylus that secondary qualities are only in the mind, he now has to work on the primary, right? He has to show him that the primary stuff also is in the mind and nowhere else. So let me turn the page. Are we clear on this? Because this is where the dialogue's going this morning, of course. She's going to deal with the that stuff. I have to now hang up the phone because I'm getting robocalls. My robocaller is not filtering everything out. Really irritates me, but there it is. So let me turn the page, and we'll see how he does this. I think maybe you can still see this. It might work really well with Blackboard. You can now see this new page, right?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I don't even have to stop sharing and restart. With Zoom, it's a little bit more cumbersome because Zoom doesn't let me do that, but Blackboard does. So even less interruption. I can just go back and scroll down. All right. So here's so Philonous, we know what he's going to do, right? His strategy is now going to be to show how each and every one of these so-called primary qualities does not exist in the object at all, but only in our perceptions, just like the secondary. So he starts with extension, shape, and extension to pick 2 of them. I'm going to the highlighted portions. Is it your opinion that the very shape and extension that you perceive by sense exists in the outer object or material substance? And Hylus says, yeah, of course. So the shape of something is in the thing. The extension of something is in the thing. Hylus is sticking to his materialistic ontology. And so Philonous says, he asks him, have all other animals as good reason as you to think that the shape and extension that they see and feel is in the outer object? And sure, Hylus says if they can think at all, then sure they would think the same way. Oh, excuse me. Okay, So here's the really interesting question. He says, consider an insect, like some really tiny, something pretty small, right? Like an insect, which appears small to us. And an insect, therefore, Philonous asks, must be able to see its own foot, and other things of that size are even smaller, seeing them all as bodies of considerable size, even though you can see them, if at all, as only many visible points, right? Like if we look at an insect, if it's a small enough insect, we may hardly even see its feet, but it certainly would see its own feet as being larger than us, right? Clear? An insect would not think its feet are
Yes.
particularly small. If an insect looked at us, we'd seem like giants, right? An insect looking at our feet would be pretty scared because they can easily be stepped on. So an insect would say our feet are huge by the same token. But if you look at your own feet, you don't necessarily think they're huge, right? Okay, but an insect's feet are going to look to it proportionately the way our feet look to ourselves, even though to us the insect's foot looks really, really tiny. And Hylus says, yeah, I mean, he's not denying that. And Philonous says, and to creatures even smaller than that insect, they will seem even bigger. And they will, he admits. So, I mean, if you imagine a mite, something really, really tiny, like an insect could look gigantic. Yeah. So Philonous says something you can hardly pick out because it is so small will appear like a huge mountain to an extremely tiny animal. Well, of course it will. It's about perspective, yes? So just as the Earth appears large to us, because if you want to walk around the Earth, that's going to take you a few years, even if you could. You can't walk around it totally. But even if you wanted to walk coast to coast, that'd be a long walk. It would seem like a very long way to go from coast to coast. But we know that the Earth is a pretty tiny planet compared to the Sun, right? It's 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, yeah? And we know there are stars even bigger than that out there. So again, it's a question of what? Perspective, correct? So size or extension is therefore a question of perspective. And that's the cutting point of this part of the argument. Can a single thing have different sizes at the same time? And Hylus says, well, it would be absurd to think so. But Philonous points out to him, from what you said, it follows that the true size of an insect's foot is the size you see it having, and the size the insect sees it having, and all the sizes it is seen as having by animals that are even smaller. That is to say, by your own principles, you're led into an absurdity. You following this? It's really important. He's saying to him, look, something can't be big and small at the same time. It's a question of perspective. So you may see something as small, but some other smaller creature may see it as big. Well, it can't be both big and small at the same time. So it cannot be the case that extendedness is a property of that thing, because if it's a property of that thing, it can't be a property that is both large and small at the same time. Right? So therefore, extendedness, as we perceive it, is a question of our perception and not a question of what's in the object. Get it? Does everybody get this point?
Yeah.
Important point. Good, great. I see a bunch of yeses. I'm happy. And it's okay if you don't, but you have to think about it. It's analogous to what? You remember the analogy about the water, about 2 bowls of water from Monday, right? If you put 2 bowls of water on the table and you know they're at the same temperature, right? They're sitting at room temperature. And you know, if you put a thermometer in them, they'll tell you they're the same. And then you heat up one hand and cool down the other hand and plunge your hands into the 2 bowls. And the bowl, one of them is going to feel hot and the other one's going to feel cold, right? Because you've heated up one hand and cooled down the other hand. So your perceptions are telling you that one bowl of water feels cold relative to warm hand, and the other bowl feels hot relative to the cooled hand. But they're the same temperature, and that's in this dialogue. And Philonous says, look, a bowl of water can't be both hot and cold at the same time, right? The water's at the same temperature. It can't be both hot and cold at the same time. So it's a question of your perceptions. It's not a property of the water at all. And here we have an analogy. Now we're dealing with so-called primary qualities, but the analogy goes through. An object can't be both large and small at the same time. And so that means the size of an object, or what they're calling its extendedness, is basically a matter of perception. And Hylus doesn't like it, because now he's going to have to start one by one abandoning this position he took on the other side of the line. He's already accepted that secondary qualities are based on perception and nothing else. And now he's going to have to start. You see, Philonous is chipping away at the primary stuff too. So Hylus says, I seem to be in some difficulty about this. Yeah, because an object like your foot can't be both large and small at the same time. So if it seems small to a giant and large to an insect, that's obviously a question of their perception. It's not a question about some property that your foot has. Okay? So Philonous just hammers this point home. He says, as we move toward or away from an object, its visible size varies, being at one distance 10 or 100 times greater than another. I mean, if you drive toward a mountain from a long distance away, the mountain doesn't look so big, correct? As you approach it, the mountain starts to look bigger. And when you finally are climbing it, you realize, wow, this is a big thing, but it didn't look that big from a distance, or it doesn't look that big when you're flying over it at 35,000 feet, right, or whatever. So it's a question of perspective. And clearly Philonous is saying, and it's a rhetorical question because he's now led to agree, Hylus is, doesn't it follow that size isn't really inherent in the object? And Hylus says, I admit, I don't know what to think. In other words, Hylus is now having to abandon this very cherished belief he still has in the inherentness of these properties in objects. But size is obviously a matter of our perception, not a matter of anything in the object. Is everybody okay with that? Okay.
Yes.
Very good. All right. As long as you're good. Okay. I see a bunch of yeses. All right. That's fine. Again, I'm obviously open to questions, but I see you already absorbed, like you've understood the roadmap of this dialogue. It's much easier since we've discussed where this is headed. You see the strategy, you see where he's going, so you can recognize these signposts along the way. Now that you have a clearer context. Okay, let me turn the page, and we'll get to. So this is what's going to happen. Basically, you have to realize that this is going to happen with everything. All right, it's going to happen with everything, and I'll just talk to you for a minute about this. I'm going to talk to you a minute about this, just so that we can be clear that we could take this list of properties one by one. So we've shown that extendedness and size are not in the object; they're in our perceptions. All right, let's go down the list. What about weight? What about the weight of something? Well, we now know, and Barclay had begun to know in his day, but he didn't really know what the formulae were. I'm not sure when Newton's laws were published. In any case, we now know that weight is a relative thing, is it not? That is to say, if you weigh, let's say you weigh 150 pounds on Earth, how much would you weigh on the moon? Does anybody know roughly what you'd weigh on the moon? Zero, not zero, Mame, not zero, because the moon has gravity, and not the same either, Ibrahim. I'm glad you guys are coming up with these answers, because we need now to do a little science. Okay, just a little. But basically, weight is a measure of the attraction that one body has for another. Anything that has mass of any kind attracts all other things that have mass, and in turn is attracted to all other things that have mass. That's a fundamental force in nature, and it's called the force of gravity. I know you all know the word gravity, but maybe no one's ever told you what it really means. So we have a certain weight on Earth. When you step on a bathroom scale, or step on a scale and weigh yourself, what you're measuring is actually the force of attraction that Earth is exerting on your body. Okay, or it's a mutual attraction. Your body's actually exerting a gravitational attraction on Earth at the same time as Earth is exerting a gravitational attraction on your body. But of course, as you all realize, the Earth is way more massive, right? The Earth weighs so much more than we do, that it's really more like a one-way street. That's why we can't jump very high, all right? Because the Earth's gravitational attraction is holding us pretty close to the surface. And that's a good thing. It's also holding the water down, preventing it from evaporating. It's holding the atmosphere together, preventing it from evaporating into space. So we need that gravity to actually be able to inhabit this Earth. But the force of gravity depends on the amount of matter that an object contains. The moon is approximately 1/6 of the Earth's mass, okay, 1/6. So whatever the Earth weighs, the moon is approximately 1/6 of that. In consequence, if you go to the moon, you're going to discover that you're going to weigh only 1/6 of what you weigh on Earth, because the power of gravity on the moon, the force of attraction, is only 1/6 as much. So if you weigh, pick a number divisible by 6. So, if you weigh 120 pounds on the Earth, then you'd only weigh 20 pounds on the moon. If you weigh 240 pounds on the Earth, you'd only weigh 40 pounds on the moon. So if you want to lose weight in a hurry, go to the moon. But that's not going to help you change your mass, right? You're not going to lose body mass. You're just going to lose. Yeah, it is fun. I understand that's how it works. You're going to lose. What you're going to lose is the force of attraction, because the moon is so much less massive than the Earth. It'll exert less of an attractive force on you. You're not going to lose any body mass, but you're going to lose weight. Okay, as it were, quote unquote weight, right? When we really lose weight, what we're really saying is we're losing body mass. Yes. And that means we step on the scale and we weigh less than we weighed last week, because we've lost that much more body mass. And that means the force of attraction Earth has to our bodies is less. Okay, so our weight goes down. Okay, but it's really our mass that's gone down. Now, people use these words very carelessly, but now I hope you have a better understanding of what they really mean. So it is possible to be weightless. You would weigh, where would you weigh 0 pounds? Where would you be weightless? Does anybody know? You guys must know. You've seen it on TV. In space, yeah, very good. In space, yes. All of you know this, right? Because in space, if you're far enough away, once you break free of the Earth's gravitational force, then it's negligible. What the Earth, once you get free of the Earth's gravitational force, relatively speaking, you're always going to be attracted to a certain extent, but it gets so weak that it doesn't really affect you anymore. And you're going to be somewhere, the sun is not affecting you, you're far enough away, the moon's not affecting you, far enough away. So if you're far enough away from the massive objects, you're going to be weightless. And maybe you're not all astronauts, but there's plenty of video up there. Now, we all know this. There's plenty of video that they shoot from space exploration, even orbital space, where stuff is floating around, right? Because they're in zero gravity. Okay? And so weight is obviously what you weigh, therefore, back to this point. What you weigh is not a property of you. We're back now to the point that Barclay is making, that your weight is not something that's a property of you, right? Because your weight changes depending on where you are relative to other gravitational mass, correct? You all get this? Great. Okay. All right. So your weight is not fixed, in other words. Huh? Weight is not fixed. It's not a primary quality that any body possesses. It's, once again, what we perceive. We put something on a scale, right? I mean, if you want to know what you weigh, you have to stand on a scale. You got to perceive it, right? And if you want to know what you weigh on the moon, you get on a scale on the moon. You want to know what you weigh in outer space. I guess that's the only time when you could say you're weightless. If you're floating around, then you pretty much know you're weightless, okay? You don't need a scale if everything's floating around. But in any other case, whatever planet you're on, if you want to know what you weigh, you got to put yourself on a scale. So your weight is basically going to be in your perception. It's not going to be in your body, okay? So we get rid of that. So we've gotten rid of extendedness, and we know now extendedness is a matter of perception. That is size, right? And now we've gotten rid of weight. So we know that weight, or what they called gravity in those days, that's a matter of perception too. Okay, so we're chipping away. We're chipping away at the list. Now I want to chip away at one even more important, in a sense, more important. Okay, weight. Okay, can somebody tell me the difference between weight versus, because this is going to chip away at something else. Weight versus mass. We talk about the weight of an object, right? Or we talk about the mass of an object. Does anybody know? I've hinted at it already in what I've told you. A mass is how much it takes up space. That would be volume, Erkin. Okay, that would be its volume. Okay, how much space you take up would be your volume, not your weight or your mass. Actually, it would be your volume. Okay, that's a different thing. Mass does not change. Abdullah, we're getting warmer, as we say, getting a little closer. And why doesn't mass change? What is it? What is mass such that it doesn't change? mass then? Weight changes. We see that weight changes depending on what planet you're on. Right? Your weight in Jupiter, you wouldn't be able to stand up. Jupiter, you'd be crushed because the gravity is so much stronger than Earth that Jupiter would just squash us with gravity. Okay, so your weight is going to change depending on relative to where you are. Why doesn't mass, Abdullah? The amount of matter, precisely, Melody. So it looks to me like some of you have had some science, okay? Because Melody's just given us a textbook definition, actually. The amount of matter, this is a kind of classic textbook definition, that the mass is the amount of matter an object contains, right? This is something that's supposedly fixed. Okay, its mass is how much matter it contains, as opposed to its weight, which is how much gravitational attraction there is. So for a very long time, and what I'm going to tell you in the next few minutes may sound like a digression, but please be attentive. Barclay was more correct than he knew. This is one of the astonishing things about Barclay. He didn't know what I'm about to tell you. He couldn't have known because it wasn't known. But in actuality, in his attempt, which is largely successful, to convince Hylus that even these so-called primary qualities don't exist in things but exist in our perceptions, he was more correct than he knew. And the reason that he was more correct than he knew is as follows. Because at his time, and scientists like Newton, great physicists like Newton and many others, all believed that mass, length, and time were all constant. Mass, length, and time were all constant, meaning they don't change. Mass, length, and time are all constant. Okay? This was believed until a very shocking thing happened, and it seems common sense to us. This was widely believed. Let me type. This was widely believed actually until 1905. People thought because it was common sense, the mass of a thing isn't going to change. Its weight might change, and it's how it appears, its size might appear to change, but the mass is like a primary quality, right? That's what Hylus wants to say, and this was what most people thought. The length of something doesn't change. How long it appears to us changes, but its actual length doesn't change. And time itself, how much time it takes for something to happen, time is not going to change. It's fixed. How we measure it might change. Whether your units are seconds or minutes or whatever, but the time itself isn't changing. This was believed. These things were thought to be constant, and that all persisted. That belief from the ancient world, pretty much. Aristotle would have thought mass, length, and time were constant, and Hylus certainly does. Barclay did, and he was very courageous. He didn't know the modern physics, but in 1905, everything changed, and we now know. Now we know that they are not constant. This was a huge shock. We know that these things which were thought for centuries to be constant are actually not even constant. Does anybody know the name of the theory that displaced that cherished but mistaken idea that they were constant? Does anybody know? You probably do know. If I tell you, you'll know. Shall I tell you? You want to guess? Thanks to, I'll give you a hint, Einstein. This is one of Einstein's big accomplishments. Thanks to Einstein's. Very good, Elijah. Bingo. The theory of relativity, in fact, special relativity. Okay, there's general, that's more complicated. Thanks to Einstein's theory. Very good. Glad you know this. Theory of, in this case, it's special. The special theory of relativity is special in general. General is more difficult. This is special relativity. It's already did enough damage. Incredible shock. Nobody even believed it at first. They had to conduct experiments. Okay, so that's correct, Elijah. Good for you. Has anybody else heard of this relativity theory? Anybody else ring a bell with any of you? It does. Good. Okay. Okay. You shouldn't make the connection. So what I'm saying is, good. I'm glad this all rings a bell. I'm glad it's common knowledge. It should be. You don't need to know the math, but you need to know the general idea that for the longest time, people pretty much everywhere thought that mass, length, and time were constant, much as Hylus does, and that they were therefore properties of the particular objects. Yeah. Something's mass doesn't change. Something's length doesn't change. And, how long something takes to happen doesn't change. The clock, like the clock ticks, if it's working correctly and it's going to keep time, it's not going to change. That's not true. Einstein showed us the world is a much stranger place than we thought. So I'll explain in words. I'm not going to revert to math, but it's very easy to explain in words that it turns out that special relativity predicted, and this has all now been borne out by experiments, that special relativity predicts that mass actually increases with velocity. That the faster an object travels, the more massive it becomes. And that's why nothing can move at the speed of light. Because if an object could move, if any of us could accelerate to the speed of light, we become infinitely massive. The closer we get to the velocity of light, the more massive we become. And at some point, it's impossible for something to be, infinitely massive. So that's why we can't travel at the speed of light. Only light can travel at the speed of light because photons have no mass. So they escape that law, and that's why light is the fastest thing in the universe. And the only way it could be that is being massless. It's just fascinating. I'm telling you, reality is a lot stranger than anybody ever figured out that it was. Okay, it continues to surprise us. Length, on the other hand, is someone trying to say something? I'm hearing chiming going on. It's okay if you want to speak. Okay, so length turns out to be just as bad. It's not constant, but it shrinks in the direction of motion. So if you take a ruler, let's say, you got a ruler, right? I don't know if anybody still uses them, but I do. I got a ruler here somewhere. And if I take a ruler that's, 1 foot long, here's my ruler. Okay, you all see that, right? It's a ruler, 12 inches plus a little extra on the end. If I take this ruler, I know pretty much it's 12 inches, okay? That's its length. It's even telling me so. If I accelerate this ruler, what's going to happen is as the ruler accelerates and starts to get really fast, and we're talking about super speeds now, beyond anything we can achieve. But as you get closer to the speed of light, the length of this thing will shrink in the direction of motion. So if the ruler could get up to the speed of light, it would have no more length. Its length would become 0. We can't do that with a ruler or anything else. But the faster it goes in the direction of motion, if I were moving along with it, here's the weird part, and this is where Barclay's right. If I were moving alongside this ruler, let's say we're both headed this way, and we're both moving at the speed of light, or close to, we couldn't move at the speed of light, but we're moving close to the speed of light. So if this ruler and I are both moving together, then I would still see this ruler as being 12 inches long because we're both moving at the same speed. So my perception of this length is going to be the same. But if you were standing still and we flashed by at a really high speed and you took a high-speed video and you looked at that frame when we passed you, your measurement of the ruler would be, it wouldn't be 12 inches anymore. It would be like condensed down to a fraction of an inch. The further we get to the speed, closer to the speed of light, the more the ruler shrinks. So that means the length of the ruler, my friends, is not a property of the ruler at all. The length of any object is a property of the perceiver. And it will change, the length as we perceive it to be, will change according to the velocity, which is really weird. And that changed our whole conception of reality. But guess what? This is exactly what Barclay is saying. He figured it out, or he guessed right back then. So we now know that extendedness is not a property of things. Weight is not a property of things. Neither is mass, nor is length. What about time? Time is maybe the most fascinating of all. So how does time change with velocity? No one would have thought this before Einstein, right? Here's the deal. Einstein tells us that the faster you go, the slower time becomes for you. It's called time dilation. It means that time passes more slowly, so an hour would seem like much longer, okay? Any chunk of time that you would measure wouldn't change for you because you're traveling at the same speed as the clock. But to an observer who's not moving at that speed, it would seem like time had slowed down, okay? So time is going faster for you standing still than it's going for somebody moving at a very high rate of speed. And your watches will be different. If you synchronize your watches, and so two people synchronize their watch, the same wristwatch, they synchronize watches, and one person stays here, and another person goes into space and comes back at a very high rate of speed, okay? Let's say they're gone for 5 hours, okay? On your watch, it says they were gone for 5 hours. When they come back, the faster they go, the slower time is. So their watch might say they were only gone for 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, or 5 minutes. And your watch would say they were gone for 5 hours. Same watch, synchronized and keeping the same time. But because of velocity and what happens to time as we speed up, time slows down. And Einstein, this sounds like science fiction, is actually how reality works, okay? Stranger than fiction. So what Einstein said was, look, you could do this, he proposed it as a twin paradox. If you took two identical twins, they don't need watches for this, because time is passing whether we're tracking it or not, right? So two identical twins on Earth, and one of them blasts off into space, okay? One of these twins goes into space and accelerates up to some, reasonably close to the velocity of light and comes back to Earth. And what will happen is that the twin who stayed on Earth may have aged like 50 years, and the one that accelerated the speed of light and came back will have aged only a couple of years because time slows down for them. Is that weird? But it's true. And that's been tested. Not with twins. We can't accelerate anybody up to that speed yet. But here's how it was done. If you want to know, I'll just tell you. I'm not making this up. They took two very, very accurate clocks. Interstellar, yeah. Is that what happens in the movie? Okay, excellent. So they finally made a movie out of this.
Yeah,
okay, great.
There's a planet that when you go, the time goes by slower. So when you come back, everybody else was older.
Right. Well, that's exactly what Einstein said in 1905. So now you know where they got the premise. Okay, great, good. I'm glad they made a movie out of it. That'll help people to know. I don't know if the movie told you that this was because of special relativity, but that was what Einstein's theory predicted. I'm glad you saw the movie. And the experiment they did, actually, was to take two cesium clocks. A clock, one of the most accurate clocks we have, is a clock that's based on the pulsation of the cesium atom. And it's just highly accurate to more fractions of a second than you'd ever need, but it's highly accurate. They took two clocks like this. They needed really highly accurate clocks because we can't accelerate things that fast. So the difference we're going to measure is going to be really tiny. So they needed really, really accurate timekeeping in order to measure that tiny difference in time. So one of the clocks stayed on Earth in a lab, and the other clock, I think it was only put in a 747. But the deal is, and a 747 only flies, 600 miles an hour? But what they did was they kept it in the air for a long time. So they kept refueling, I believe they kept refueling the 747. So it was flying for a very long time, okay, at a rate of speed, which is still much higher than the relatively stationary clock on Earth. And what they ended up with was a measurable difference. And when they came back and compared the two clocks, they took the clock out of the plane when it landed, and they compared the two clocks. And indeed, the clock that had been on the plane now looked like it was running slower than the clock. It had lost time because time had slowed down for that clock. So it was running slower than the clock on Earth. So that means that time is not a property of a clock either, or of a measuring device. It's not something that's passing absolutely or objectively. It's dependent on the perceiver. That's a really amazing thing, but it's also true. And I mean, you can experience this as a matter of common sense. We all know the Earth is orbiting, right, around the sun. Does anybody know the speed at which the Earth is orbiting around the sun? We know it's turning on its axis too. Easier for us to know that the sun appears to rise and set because the Earth is turning. Does anybody, and we know the duration takes 24 hours, right? We know that because our clocks are calibrated to that. But does anybody know roughly what the velocity of the Earth is as not only it orbits, but it's moving around the sun? Yeah, it takes a year. What's the speed of the Earth? 30,000 meters per second. That maybe sounds right. Or I'm not so good with the MKS. I think it's around 19,000 miles an hour. Okay, but it's of that order of magnitude, many thousands of units per second. Okay, it's pretty fast. Now, do any of you feel like you're moving at 30,000 meters per second? I mean, you're sitting still here, right? We're all sitting in front of our computers. No, you don't. No, you don't. So you would say you're not moving, right? you would say you're not moving. And Hylus would say to Barclay, we're sitting here, discussing this, we're not moving. Well, that's because we don't feel like we're moving. But if you think about it, we're all moving at 30,000 meters a second. It's just that we're relative to the Earth, we're stationary. But relative to the solar system, we're moving at a huge rate of speed. We're moving faster than a bullet travels. 19,000 miles an hour is much faster than a bullet out of a gun, much faster than a rocket blasting off from, Cape Kennedy or Canaveral, whatever they call it these days. So basically, well, that's a paradox, Mohammed. Okay, this is becoming now. If we have in science and in philosophy, there are incredible paradoxes that come out of time travel. If you could go back in time, this is a total digression, and I'll give you 2 minutes because it's a great question and I like it. But it produces paradoxes. If, for example, if you could go back in time, let's say you went back in time and you interacted with stuff, right? And you caused something to happen by your going back in time. Let's say you accidentally changed the future of, or the past rather, of one of your parents. You went back in time, and let's say something you did prevented your parents from meeting each other. Okay? Then how could you have been born? So then you couldn't have gone back in time. So there are a lot of science fiction novels, many science fiction novels based on this paradox. Okay, movies too by now, Erica. I have no doubt. But because this is an insolvable, for us, it's a problem that can't be solved. If we could go back in time, then we could potentially do things that would change the course of history, and it would, or just events, just because we went back. And if that could then affect us in the future, then how could we be us, and how could we ever go back, right? So that's a whole other story. But I'm glad you guys are thinking about this now. But let's go back to Barclay. So mass, length, and time are therefore not properties of any object. Is this clear? That's modern science, ever since relativity theory, that actually tells Barclay, you know what, he was right. And he has other arguments, but he was absolutely right about even these things. So now Hylus is in trouble. Let's go back to the screen share. I mean, Hylus is now in serious trouble because there seems to be nothing left, yes? There appears to be, if you think about it, he's now stripped away. Have we left anything out? We took away extendedness. It's a matter of perception. We took away weight, matter of perception, mass, length, time. Density is mass per unit volume, which is a quotient of mass over extendedness. Both of those are perceptions, so density is a perception too. So therefore, everything is going to be a matter of perception, and there's actually nothing left of any of these so-called primary qualities that belongs to the object. So through this line of argument, Philonous has now accomplished his mission. He has managed to convince Hylus that there is nothing out there that could possibly exist independent of a perceiving mind. And therefore, reality in the end is only ideas. There's no stuff out there. If there was stuff out there, we could only know there was stuff out there if we perceived it. And in the end, the only real contact we have with the world is through the immediate perceptions of the senses, which then turn into mediate perceptions. Our ideas of things are really the only way that things exist. If we have no idea of anything, it means that thing for us is non-existent. So this is very, very counterintuitive and a very distressing argument for any materialists, of course. So let's go back and see what Hylus's reaction to this is, because now there's nothing left. And I'll share this screen with you, because Hylus has one more kind of rabbit up his, it's a part of the hat, okay? He has one more card up his sleeve, whatever metaphor you prefer. Hylus is not wanting to give up the idea of externally existing stuff. It's very difficult for a materialist to concede, obviously. It's a shocking thing, and he doesn't want to do it. So he changes his tactic, and he does it in a really interesting way. It's going to lead to a fairly complicated argument, and I want to spend the next 10 minutes making it clear to you, okay? We'll explicate his argument, and then you'll understand, hopefully, the way that Hylus is disabused of that, the way that Philonous shows him that argument leads to an absurdity, so it can't possibly be true. And we'll share the screen. So now the has convinced him, secondary qualities. independent of perception. There's no primary qualities independent of a perceiving mind. Hylus finally has nowhere to go. Right? He says, I admit, Philonous, that when I look carefully at what goes on in my mind, all I can find is that I'm a thinking being that has a variety of sensations. And I can't conceive how a sensation could exist in an unperceiving substance. So there you go. That's exactly what Philonous convinced of at the beginning, right? That all the world is only made of ideas. Existence is totally dependent on perception. But he's still now going to dig in his heels. Well, this is the last stand, okay, of materialism. On the other hand, I look in an extremely different way at sensible things. He's still not giving up the idea, even though he knows that he's now been convinced that this can't happen. When I look a different way, he says, at sensible things, considering them as so many properties and qualities, I find, he says, I have to suppose a material substratum without which they can't be conceived exist. So he's saying there's something else out there. He's saying even though the primary qualities and the secondary qualities are only perceptions in the mind, there's still got to be something else out there, and I'm going to call it a material substratum. Okay, material means made of stuff, right? Matter. And substratum, that's a Latin word. A substratum means that which it's sub is underneath. It's right, the preposition under, like submarine, under the ocean, right? Or substance, something that stands under things. Substratum, stratum, you know the word stratum. It's a layer, right? It's a layer. Striations are layers. Yes? Have you encountered that word? Anybody? I'm going to come back for a minute to chat room, just to make sure. You know, you're familiar with it? Yeah, good. Okay. So substratum, literally, it's Latin. It's an English word. But literally, substratum literally means under layer. Yeah, sub is under, stratum is layer. So literally, I'm typing this in. Literally means under layer. So it's like reality has an underlayer. Okay, it means underlayer. So what Hylus is trying to argue now is that all these properties are in fact, I can't share application now. It says, all right, I'll come back to them. Substratum really means underlayer. So Hylus is saying, well, there's something else out there, even if there are no primary or secondary qualities except in our perceptions. There's got to be something out there that's like underneath everything, that's supporting existence, and he calls it an underlayer. So you see what he's trying to do? He's trying to resurrect this idea of externally existing substance, right? Because he can't quite abandon it, even though Philonous is now convinced that everything that exists is existing only in the perceptions. That's all the only evidence we have of existence is in perception. So he's now calling this thing out there an underlayer, a substratum. And he says that's out there. That really exists. So let me see if I can share the screen again. It was weird. It got out because I guess I was typing and it didn't like that. Okay, so I'm sharing with you. You can all see this. Somebody say yes?
It's a black screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So what he's now saying is that you can't see. Somebody can't see. No, you can't see?
It's like
okay, you all can't. All right, I'm going to reload the session. Just bear with me. I hope. All right, we're back. Are we back? Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you hear me. Okay, I have to reload the session. This is, technology, right? Stuff crashes, right? So this thing crashed. I've never crashed it before, but let me try harder or we can crash it again. All right, let's try and share the screen now so we can get back to business. We're almost at the end of the lecture. I want to make sure that we cover, this is very important, this last part. And I'm going to not get too fancy. I won't type and share at the same time. I'll just try and share this with you. It doesn't seem to like this at all. I'm not able to pull up the actual text. Let me try again. There it is. Okay, can you all see this?
It's still black.
No.
No, you can't. All right, let me try one more time. I'm going to make one more effort to do it. And if not, I'll talk you through it. I can talk you through it, and you have the text anyway. As long as you can hear and see me, and then we can insert bells and whistles. But it's like the connection is good this morning, obviously. So bear with me, please. I'm going to make one last attempt to share this with you. And if not, I'll just talk you through it, okay? You all have the text anyway. All right.
No.
No.
Nobody sees it. Okay, so that means strike three, we're out. Okay, but you can still hear me and see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll just walk through it, all right? So you've understood that Hylus is now proposing something ridiculous because he's trying to salvage his materialistic ontology. And so he's saying, well, there has to be something else out there. You know, I concede that primary and secondary qualities are just in our minds, okay, but there's still something out there, and I'm calling it a material substratum, yeah? Material substratum. And Falon is going to turn this into an impossibility by a very clever argument, which I'll now go over with you. So Falona says, oh, material substratum, he says, you call it? He says, okay, so which of your senses acquainted you with it? Well, excuse me, if something exists, it means we perceived it, right? So Falona says, okay, you say there's a material substratum out there, so which sense did you use to perceive it, right? And Hylus says, well, it's not sensible. It itself is not sensible. Only its properties and qualities are perceived by the senses. So Falona says, oh, so you didn't sense it. So I presume then you obtained the idea of it through reflection and reason. And Hylus says, I don't claim to have any proper positive idea of it. So in other words, he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? And Hylus says, well, I really don't know what I'm talking about, but it has to be there because there has to be something supporting all these other qualities, and otherwise they couldn't possibly exist only in my mind. So there has to be something out there that supports them, says Hylus, and he's calling that material substratum. So now here's the argument that gets rid of it. And as follows. So Falona says, if the substratum is actually supporting the other qualities, imagine it's like a foundation and you can't see it, but Hylus says it's out there. Something has to be supporting all these other qualities. So the substratum is the support. It stands underneath these things and it supports them, okay? So fine. So that Falona then says, okay, so if it actually supports them, it's somehow like them, yeah? It's like spread out under them. And they're all resting on it. So let's say, for example, it supports extension, right? The property of taking up space. If that property of taking up space, of having length or mass or volume, if the property of having length is supported by a substratum, then that substratum itself has to be spread underneath it in order to support it, right? And Hylus says yes. And so the substratum itself has extendedness. If the substratum is going to support the property of extendedness, then it also has to be extended. Yes, otherwise it couldn't possibly support extension. So it must also have extension. Are you with me so far? If something's going to support something, it has to be spread underneath it. If a foundation's going to support a building, then it has to be spread underneath the building, clearly. So if a substratum is going to support the quality of extendedness, then the substratum itself needs to be extended. And Hylus has to agree. His own logic is saying, yeah, it has to be true. If it's supporting extension, it must be extended under extension. And so it also, therefore, needs to be extended and therefore the property of extendedness. And now he's caught in a trap because Falona says, oh, okay, so you're saying now that this substratum called, the substratum itself has extension. But you've just said, yes, Erkin, excellent. You're following you're right on the mark. Okay, substratum, the substratum. Yeah, there's going to be, if a substratum has extendedness, then what's supporting that, right? Well, there then has to be a substratum. Yeah, there has to be something supporting the substratum. If it has the same property that it too is supporting, then it also needs support. If all properties are supported by something, then the substratum, which supports the property of extendedness, as an example, has to have the same property. So it would need support too. So there would have to be a substratum to support the substratum that supports extendedness. Exactly. But then you see where the problem comes? Oh, but wait a second. So the substratum has to be spread under the substratum, right? If it's going to support it, it has to be spread under it. So the substratum would also need to have the property of extendedness, and that means that the substratum itself needs to be supported by a substratum. So Melody asks, wouldn't that mean that the substratum doesn't exist because existence is part of it? Existence doesn't exist. No, Melody, that's not quite the right track. Please stay on track, okay? He is saying that there's something out there that supports all these qualities. But then Philonis says, if there's a substratum supporting all the qualities, then it's supporting, among other things, extension. And if it's supporting extension, then it must also be extended under extension in order to support it. And so that means it itself has the property of extendedness, and so it also needs to be supported by the same argument. So if a substratum has extension, it needs to be supported by a substratum. But if that substratum is supporting the substratum that supports the substratum, everything that's being supported needs more support. And so this becomes what we call an infinite regression. That's right. It's exactly right, Ibrahim. Infinite regression problem. Erica says it makes no sense because it would just keep going. LOL. Yes, it's funny, but it's impossible because you need, therefore, exactly right. That's the term. Anything that leads to an infinite regress is not sustainable. There cannot be an infinite number of substrata out there which can be sensed. That's crazy. Right? That's an absolutely crazy explanation. So anything that leads to an argument of infinite regress has intrinsically some flaw in the argument. And once Hylus is made to see that he needs a substratum to support the substratum, and then he needs a substratum, a substratum to support the substratum, and this goes on infinitely. And so basically, he has to give that up. So that means that the original argument goes through, and that existence is nothing more than perception, and there isn't anything out there that you could postulate which cannot be perceived. That would be ridiculous. Okay, and that's the main ontological argument. So the shocking part of it is that it leads us to the conclusion that Philonis leads Hylus to, namely that all of existence is just is ideas. Like there's nothing material in the world. The world is made literally of our ideas. And that's a pretty big ontological shock, right? Two further points. So now we've seen this contrast between Descartes, who's a dualist, and Barclay, who's an idealist. He's a monist and supports idealism. Only ideas, nothing else. Next week, we're going to look at Churchland, and he's in your reader. We're back to Paul Churchland. This is what's upcoming. So we're going to get another version now of monism, right? Which is going to be the materialistic one. The one I expect that most of you are more comfortable with, right? That the world is made of stuff, the really good stuff. So Paul Churchland, and the reading is called Eliminative Materialism. Eliminative. Churchland and his wife, Tricia, they're partners in this. They're both eliminative. They invented this phrase. It's a special kind of materialism. And you should read ahead over the weekend. For Monday's lecture. Paul Churchland, his wife also writes on this, Patricia. The reading we have is from Paul. It's called Eliminative Materialism. I won't say more about it except to tell you that he's a radical materialist. You know, everybody so far is a radical. Okay, we're meeting a lot of radicals in this course for good reason. I want to show you how extreme things look when you push them to their logical conclusions. So Descartes is a radical skeptic. Berkeley is a radical empiricist of the essentialist variety, the idealist variety, rather, and Churchland is a radical materialist too. We'll see how he takes things in his direction. But here's the reminder about the ulterior motive that Berkeley had. 2 more points, and I'll take questions. Remember that Berkeley had an ulterior motive, and this question came up on Monday. I don't know if it was one of you who posed it, but somebody in the group Monday, a very large group, posed this question about what happens to paintings in a museum. You know, when the museum closes and there's nobody there. Do they disappear? According to Barclay, if they're not being perceived, they don't exist, right? So great question, and the answer is that they exist because they're being perceived. If something exists continuously, I mean, to be consistent with Barclay, that's right, Erica, God is perceiving things. So that's how, if you live alone, you know, and like you go to sleep at night and you're not perceiving yourself, do you vanish and sort of come back into existence the next morning? That'd be crazy. It's much more plausible for Barclay, certainly, to suppose that continuous existence implies continuous perception. So if something continuously exists, it must be continuously perceived. And who is possible, who or what? Only God is capable of that. So God is continuously perceiving everything, and that's the explanation of how the earth existed before there was life on it. If there was no life on earth, then how did the earth exist? Well, God was perceiving it. So that's Berkeley's answer. The fact that continuous existence implies continuous perception, and the only being capable of continuous perception of everything is God. So he introduces that, and this whole dialogue is meant to remind people that materialism has a de-spiritualizing effect. And Berkeley, as I mentioned Monday, was concerned about the effects of materialism, and he even saw them 300 years ago, right? He still saw the Industrial Revolution unfolding, and it was making people more materialistic and less spiritual. And he thought that would be bad for society if we got too materialistic and we lost our spirituality. Maybe he's right, and certainly maybe some of you can relate to that, that if we lose our spirituality, it somehow makes us less than we might be. And so Berkeley wrote these dialogues as a way of reminding people that there's more to the universe than mere material, okay? That was his ulterior motive. And then there's a very famous poem I want to share with you. I don't know if I can share this. If not, I'll send you a link. But this student wrote a very funny limerick. I'm not so sure that I can share anything anymore, but I pulled it up this morning before class, and let's see if the software is going to cooperate one more time. No, I don't think it will. So anyway, there's a poem about a limerick about God in the quad of a university, and I know it's not going to allow me to share it. So that basically, just remember, Berkeley's reason for doing this is to remind people of the importance of spirituality, that materialism alone is not enough to make us fully human in some sense. Okay, are there any questions? So that takes us to the end of Berkeley. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? No questions from Melody. Mohammed, is this a correct reading for next week? I didn't quite see that. Hang on, let me pull up your chat. Daniel Harris, teaching online. Well, Churchland, I don't know that it's the correct reading. The correct reading is in the required text, okay? And it's if you can find a work called Eliminative Materialism somewhere, then it would be correct. I can try and click on this PDF, Mohammed. I don't know what that's going to do to Blackboard. Okay, it might seem to it might crash Blackboard. So what I've typed in is what is there. It's in the required text, and it's called Eliminative Materialism. So please have a look for yourselves. You're now asking about the due dates, and all of you have been attentive. I'm happy to see it. I will give you 2 weeks' notice. Okay? Don't worry yet about the essay. Worry about the next reading. Let me see if I can click on this. I hope it doesn't crash the. Apparently, it didn't crash Blackboard. Oh yes, very good. Right. Okay, I can now answer your question. And so you know, you don't need the book for this. So I've told you guys at the beginning, the book has almost everything, and whatever the book doesn't have, I've uploaded. But if you want to do extra work to poke around in you know, cyberspace and find the readings, that's fine. So now back to you, Mohammed. Yes, that's the correct reading. It's called Eliminative Materialism by Paul Churchland, and that's also in your books. Okay, so please have a look at it. It's a very interesting and challenging reading. And we're going to see how, for example, Paul Churchland, who's a contemporary, he's at University of California. And what Paul Churchland does, basically, is he's also a monist, right? He believes there's only one mode of being, but completely contrary to Barclay, Churchland asserts that the only mode of being is, in fact, material. So everything in the world is material, and nothing is immaterial. So that's the other extreme of monism, correct? And so what he's doing is he's going to in favor of a materialistic view of things, but because he's a radical materialist, he's also going to go further than that, and he's going to tell us that some of the vocabulary we use in our everyday lives and our everyday thinking and everyday speech actually needs to be eliminated because it's obscuring the true nature of reality, and it's therefore confusing us and not allowing us to discover as much as we could about the material nature of the world. And that's the eliminative part. He and his wife really did this. When they sit down and have breakfast together, they don't, certain words they don't use. They've restricted their vocabulary to the material. We'll have a look at some examples. It's in the text, and we'll see them next week, okay, historically, and also now in more contemporary veins. Any further questions? We still have a couple of minutes. Anything else? All good? Freezy says all good. Okay. I'm happy. Muy bien. Okay. If all is good, all is good. We've now done 2 weeks. Muy bien. Sí. Okay. Soy feliz. I'm happy if everything's good with you guys. And we've now covered 2 major philosophers, Descartes and Berkeley. We're going to jump into the contemporary time now. Churchland is a contemporary philosopher, but it's the same argument, right? Philosophers argue over centuries about these things. We're going to look at a more contemporary philosopher. But you're doing well, and we're getting through this first section. Don't worry about the essays. I will assign due dates shortly, but you're going to have 2 weeks notice, so don't worry about that. And answer only one of those questions when you get around to actually writing it. You don't have to do that yet. The first group of essay questions pertains exactly to the 5 readings, okay? And we've only done 2 of those readings. So don't worry yet. I'll keep you posted. You're very welcome. You're all very welcome. I want you to have a great day and a great weekend, okay? Enjoy your weekend. Do some reading. Stay with it. And we will resume on Monday morning, those of you who can make it, yes. I'll see you Monday. I'll start Churchland on Monday. And as always, it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel. And as always, this Thursday, this lecture is going to be on Blackboard. Wonderful. All of you, thank you so much. Have a great day. We'll see you all next week, okay? Take care. Be safe. And thank you. Be safe. Be well. Bye-bye. See you next weekend. So long. See you next week, I mean. Bye-bye. Bye.